Lee Jae-hyun, the millionaire CEO, carried the weight of an empire and the shadow of an irreparable loss. A widower, his heart was a block of ice, and his mansion, a palace of silence where his two daughters, confined to wheelchairs, lived in their own world of pain and isolation. No maid lasted, none could break the barrier of sadness that enveloped the family. Until Kim Min-ji, a humble cleaner with a gentle smile, was hired. He saw her only as another employee, but one day, returning home exhausted, an unusual sound echoed through the cold corridors. Laughter, children's laughter. It was his daughters. And in the midst of them, on the floor, was Minji, playing with them as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Lee Jae-hyun's heart, long dormant, felt an unexpected warmth. The sound, those laughs, they resonated through the marble corridors, which for years had been tombs of silence and echoes of sadness. Lee Jae-hyun stopped, his leather briefcase still clutched in his hand, his heart, which he thought was petrified, now beating with a strange, almost painful cadence. He didn't move, didn't breathe, fearing that any movement could break the spell, dissipate the mirage. Through the crack of the half-open main hall door, he saw. His vision, accustomed to the calculating coldness of spreadsheets and contracts, now fixed on a scene that defied all his reality. Minji was on the floor, sitting cross-legged, her loose hair falling softly over her shoulders as she gestured with her hands. In front of her, in their wheelchairs, were his daughters Yoonji and Hyeji. Their faces, usually pale and marked by an early resignation, were now illuminated. Yoonji's eyes, which rarely showed more than a deep melancholy, shone with contagious joy. Hyeji, the youngest, was leaning forward, her small hands outstretched, trying to touch Minji's, who was playing peekaboo with her fingers, making them giggle. It was a sound he hadn't heard since before the accident, a sound he had buried along with the memory of his wife, believing he would never hear it again. His daughters, trapped in their bodies, trapped in their pain, had closed themselves off from the world, and he, Lee Jae-hyun, had closed himself off from them, from himself, from any remnant of happiness. He had tried everything. The best doctors, the most renowned therapists, nurses with palliative care experience, specialized tutors. None of them had managed even a genuine smile, much less this explosion of life. Who was this woman? The cleaner, the woman he had hired without even looking into her eyes, just another in the long line of disposable employees. She was there, on the cold floor of his mansion, dressed in a simple apron, and she was doing the impossible. She wasn't treating his daughters as patients, as victims, as a burden. She was playing with them, as if they were ordinary children, full of life, full of possibilities. A sharp pang of something he couldn't identify pierced his chest. Was it envy, jealousy, or was it hope? Hope was a poison. He had learned the hard way. It promised, deluded, and then snatched everything away with unparalleled cruelty. He had built such high walls around his heart to protect himself from it, to protect his daughters from further disappointments. And now, this woman with a smile and a finger game was demolishing everything. He watched Minji. Her movements were gentle, her voice a melodic whisper that seemed to cradle the girls in a cocoon of affection. She didn't seem to be acting. There was no forced artificiality he saw in other caregivers. It was genuine. The way she looked at Yoonji and Hyeji, not with pity, but with pure affection, disarmed something within him. He saw Minji pick up a small rag doll that was lying beside Hyeji's chair, and with it began to enact a small story, using funny voices that made the girls squirm with laughter. He felt a sudden, irrational anger at himself for not having been able to provide this, anger at fate that had stolen his daughter's childhood, and a pang of fear that this joy would be ephemeral, that Minji would be like all the others, that one day she would get tired, or that he, with his cold presence, would drive her away. What would happen if his daughters became attached to her and she left? He couldn't bear to see them suffer again. He couldn't bear to see himself suffer again. The sound of his own footsteps, however soft, seemed like thunder in the silence he had maintained. He moved a little closer to the door, his body tense, every muscle on alert. He wanted to turn and flee, go back to the office where numbers were predictable and emotions non-existent, but his feet were rooted to the floor. He needed to understand. He needed to know what this magic she possessed was. Minji, absorbed in the doll's story, didn't notice him immediately, but the children, with their keen sensitivity, felt the change in the atmosphere. Yunji's eyes, still shining with joy, shifted to the door. The smile on her lips wavered, and the hand that had been trying to reach the doll now recoiled slightly. Hyeji, following her sister's gaze, also stopped laughing. The silence, heavy and familiar, began to settle again in the hall. Minji felt it, that shiver down her spine that indicated a presence. She looked up, and the gentle smile that adorned her face slowly faded as she met Lee Jae-hyun's icy, complex gaze. He was there, standing in the doorway, an imposing shadow, his dark eyes fixed on her, and then on his daughters. The doll fell from her hands. Minji's heart skipped a beat, not just from surprise, but from a sudden apprehension. What would he think? Would he fire her for playing during work hours, for daring to bring joy to such a gloomy place? The magical moment shattered, and the weight of reality fell upon her. Lee Jae-hyun didn't say a word, but his gaze, an indecipherable mixture of shock, curiosity, and an ancient pain, spoke volumes. The air in the vast marble room became dense, heavy with Lee Jae-hyun's unexpected presence. Minji's smile had dissolved like mist in the sun, replaced by an expression of apprehension she tried, in vain, to hide. Her eyes, once full of warmth and joy, now reflected a mixture of guilt and fear. The rag doll, a moment before the protagonist of an enchanting story, lay forgotten on the floor, a silent testament to the magical moment that had been brutally interrupted. Lee Jae-hyun didn't move, didn't speak. His gaze, penetrating and cold, swept the scene. First Minji, kneeling on the floor, her hand still slightly outstretched, as if trying to retain the escaping joy. Then, his daughters. Yunji, her eyes fixed on him, the small hand that had been gesturing now resting motionless in her lap. Hyeji, the youngest, had shrunk slightly in her chair, the sparkle in her eyes replaced by a familiar shadow of resignation. The silence that followed was not the comfortable, complicit silence from before, but the oppressive silence he knew so well, the silence that had become the permanent tenant of his house. He felt a knot in his throat, a strange mixture of anger and something else, something he refused to name. Anger because this woman, a simple cleaner, had achieved in minutes what he, with all his power and resources, had not achieved in years. Anger because his daughter's joy was so fragile, so ephemeral, fading at his mere presence. And what was that other feeling? A pang of pain, perhaps, the pain of seeing what he had lost, what he had allowed his daughters to lose. Minji, his voice sounded grave and controlled, breaking the silence like a shard of ice. There was no explicit anger in his tone, but a coldness that was even more intimidating. What is happening here? Minji felt a shiver run down her spine. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes downcast. "Mr. Lee," she began, her voice a whisper, I was just playing with the girls." She knew it sounded like a flimsy excuse, an admission of guilt. In her mind, she already saw the dismissal letter, the exit door. Lee Jae-hyun took a step forward, and the sound of his shoes on the marble echoed through the room. "Playing?" he repeated, the word laden with subtle sarcasm. "Your job, Miss Kim, is to clean. It is not to entertain." His words were like whips, but what struck her most was how the girls reacted. Yunji pressed her lips together, and Hyeji let out a small sigh, almost inaudible, but which to Minji sounded like a lament. Her heart ached. She didn't care about the reprimand, but seeing the joy disappear from the children's faces was unbearable. "I'm sorry, sir," Minji said, her voice firmer now, a thread of dignity emerging amidst the fear. "I know it's my job, but They were so quiet, and I thought that maybe a little joy could be good." She dared to look up, meeting his gaze for a brief instant. There was something there behind the coldness, a confusion she couldn't decipher. Lee Jae-hyun averted his gaze from her, fixing it on his daughters. His eyes scanned their pale faces, the wheelchairs that were prisons for their bodies. He saw the absence of smiles, the quietness that had returned. It was as if the light Minji had lit had been extinguished by his own shadow. A sharp, unexpected pang of guilt pierced his chest. He was the reason. He was the darkness. "They don't need entertainment," he said, his voice lower now, almost a murmur, but still carrying an unquestionable authority. "They need peace and proper care." He turned to Minji again. "Do you understand the gravity of their condition, Miss Kim? They are fragile. Any excessive excitement can be harmful." Minji felt a flush rise to her face. It was a veiled accusation, an insinuation that she was being irresponsible. "Sir, I would never do anything to harm them. I just wanted for them to smile." She couldn't hide the emotion in her voice. It was the truth. She had no ulterior motives, just a pure desire to alleviate the pain she saw in the girl's eyes. Lee Jae-hyun studied her. The sincerity in her eyes was undeniable. There was no malice, no artifice, just a naive kindness he had forgotten existed. He had expected resistance, elaborate excuses, perhaps even tears, but not this frankness, this simplicity. It was disarming. He closed his eyes for an instant, the weight of the day, the weight of his life, crushing him. The laughter. He could still hear them, a ghostly echo that refused to disappear. They had been real. His daughters had laughed, and he had been responsible for extinguishing that light. "Clean the hall," he finally said, his voice returning to its usual cold, distant tone. It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't a compliment. It was an order, devoid of emotion, but laden with an underlying tension. "And then go home. Your shift is over." Minji felt a relief mixed with a pang of disappointment. She hadn't been fired, but his coldness was an impenetrable wall. "Yes, sir," she replied, bowing slightly. She picked up the rag doll from the floor, smoothing it with a gentle gesture, and placed it back in Hyeji's chair, who watched her with sad eyes. Lee Jae-hyun observed the gesture, the way she touched the doll, the way her eyes lingered on his daughters for an instant, a silent apology, a farewell. He saw the pain on her face, and for a moment felt strangely connected to her. Both were guardians of a sadness that seemed endless. He turned and walked towards the staircase, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He didn't look back, but as he ascended, the image of the laughter, the sound of his daughter's joy and Minji's gentle face remained etched in his mind. The palace of silence had been briefly invaded by life, and now the silence seemed even deeper, even colder. He knew something had changed. The barrier in his heart, which he had built with such care, had a crack, and he didn't know if he could fix it, or if he wanted to. The echo of Lee Jae-hyun's footsteps died on the marble staircase, taking with it the last spark of warmth that had dared to ignite in that hall. Minji remained there, kneeling for an instant, the weight of his gaze still on her shoulders, the coldness of his words etched into her soul. It wasn't the reprimand that hurt her, nor the veiled threat of dismissal. It was the sight of the girls' smiles fading, the joy draining from their eyes like sand through fingers. The rag doll, which a moment before had been the star of an imaginary adventure, now rested again in Hyeji's chair, a silent reminder of what had been lost. She stood up, her movements slow, heavy. The cleaner's apron felt more like a uniform of guilt. With an almost inaudible sigh, Minji picked up the cloth and the bucket, resuming the task she had been assigned. Every movement was mechanical, but her mind was buzzing. How could he be so blind, so closed off to light? She looked at Yunji and Hyeji, who now watched the floor, their shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying the weight of the world. Minji's heart ached. She wanted to hug them, tell them it was okay, that joy would return. But the walls of that house and the invisible gaze of its owner prevented her. As she cleaned the immaculate marble, her thoughts turned to the irony of the situation. She, a simple cleaner, had been able to elicit genuine laughter from those children, while their father, with all his wealth and power, seemed only capable of offering them an oppressive silence. There was a deep sadness in Lee Jae-hyun. She could feel it. A pain so ancient and ingrained that it had turned into coldness. But that pain, she thought, did not have to be the fate of his daughters. Minji's shift finally ended. She folded her apron, putting it away in the supply closet. Before leaving, she turned to the girls. Yunji and Hyeji were still in their chairs, motionless, like statues. Minji approached, hesitant. "See you tomorrow, girls," she whispered, her voice laden with a tenderness she couldn't contain. She wanted to touch their hair, but restrained herself. Instead, she just smiled. A small, sad smile. Yunji looked up, and for a brief instant, Minji saw a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a silent plea, before the girl's eyes returned to fix on the void. Hyeji merely blinked, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. Minji felt a pang of hope. They heard her. They felt her. As she left the mansion, the cold air of the Korean night enveloped her, but it wasn't as icy as the atmosphere she had just left behind. She walked down the street, the image of Lee Jae-hyun, imposing and distant, and the echo of the girl's laughter mingling in her mind. She knew she should just do her job and go home, forget what had happened. But something inside her had been touched. The innocence of those children, the pain in their eyes, the need for a little light. She couldn't just ignore it. The fear of being fired was still there, but it was overshadowed by a silent determination. Meanwhile, upstairs, Lee Jae-hyun had locked himself in his office. The faint light from his computer monitor illuminated his tense face. He tried to focus on financial reports, complex graphs, numbers that had always been his refuge. But the words danced on the screen, meaningless. Instead of profits and losses, he saw his daughters' smiles, the sparkle in their eyes, the movement of their small hands trying to reach the doll. And then the image of Minji kneeling on the floor, her face radiating a kindness he hadn't seen in years, perhaps decades. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. He walked to the window, observing the city below, a sea of twinkling lights that seemed as distant as happiness. The anger he had felt before had transformed into a disturbing confusion. Why had he reacted that way? Why did their joy irritate him so much? Was it envy? Fear? Fear that they would become attached to someone who could leave at any moment, like so many other people in their lives. Fear that he wouldn't be able to protect them from the pain he himself felt. The crack in his heart, which he had briefly perceived, now seemed to widen, allowing a current of suppressed emotions to flow. Guilt was the strongest. Guilt for having extinguished the light. Guilt for having been the darkness. He had built such high walls to protect himself from pain that he had ended up imprisoning himself, and worse, his daughters. He remembered Minji's voice, firm despite the fear, defending her intention to bring joy. There was a purity there that disarmed him, a simplicity that he, in his world of complexity and power, had forgotten how to recognize. He took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in his lungs. The silence of the house, which had once been a familiar comfort, now seemed an unbearable burden. It was a silence that screamed the absence of life, the absence of laughter, the absence of his wife. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could hear the echo of his daughter's laughter again, mixed with Minji's soft, melodious voice. It was a sound he didn't know he missed until he heard it. Lee Jae-hyun opened his eyes, his expression hardened again. He couldn't afford to feel. Feelings were weaknesses, and he couldn't be weak. Not for his daughters. He had to maintain control, order, but the image of the rag doll forgotten on the floor and Hyeji's sad gaze persisted in his mind. He knew something had changed that day. A line had been crossed, a barrier, however much he tried to deny it, had been broken, and from that moment on, the silence of that house would never be the same. He didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. Minji's presence, the cleaner, had become an unpredictable and disturbing element in his meticulously controlled life, and he had no idea how to deal with it. The clock on Lee Jae-hyun's office wall ticked the hours with cruel indifference, each tick-tock a reminder of the time he wasted, unable to concentrate. Financial reports, once his refuge and fortress, now seemed mere meaningless hieroglyphs. Words danced on the screen, but his eyes saw only the fleeting sparkle in his daughter's eyes, the movement of their small hands trying to reach the doll, the laughter that had filled the hall. And then Minji's face, kneeling on the floor, radiating a kindness he had forgotten existed. He stood up again, the chair scraping the marble with a shrill sound that echoed in the oppressive silence. He walked to the window, observing the city below, a sea of twinkling lights that seemed as distant as happiness. The anger he had felt before had transformed into a disturbing confusion. Why did their joy irritate him so much? Was it envy? Fear? Fear that they would become attached to someone who could leave at any moment, like so many other people in their lives. Fear that he wouldn't be able to protect them from the pain he himself felt. He didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. Minji's presence, the cleaner, had become an unpredictable and disturbing element in his meticulously controlled life, and he had no idea how to deal with it. Meanwhile, in the cold streets of Seoul, Minji walked home, the icy wind whipping her face, but the external coldness did not compare to the storm of emotions within her. The fear of being fired was still there, a persistent shadow, but it was overshadowed by a silent determination. She couldn't get Yoonji's and Hyeji's eyes out of her head. The way joy had blossomed and withered so quickly, that man, Lee Jae-hyun, was an enigma of pain and power, but his daughters were just children, trapped in their grief. She remembered the sparkle in Yoonji's eyes when the doll flew, Hyeji's little laugh. Those moments were too precious to be extinguished by fear or a father's coldness. Minji felt a deep connection with the girls, an empathy that transcended her position as a cleaner. She had seen the pain in their own eyes, the loneliness that wealth could not fill. Upon arriving at her small apartment, the simplicity of her home contrasted sharply with the opulence of the Lee mansion. She prepared a hot tea, her hands still a little shaky. The image of Lee Jae-hyun, imposing and distant, and the echo of the girl's laughter mingled in her mind. She knew she should just do her job and go home, forget what had happened, but something inside her had been touched. The innocence of those children, the pain in their eyes, the need for a little light. She couldn't just ignore it. The night dragged on for Lee Jae-hyun. He finally lay down, but sleep did not come. Every shadow, every creak of the house seemed to amplify the emptiness. He found himself thinking about the next morning. Minji would return. He would see her again. The idea, once annoying, now carried a strange layer of anticipation. What would she do? How would she act? He had been harsh, but she hadn't completely bowed. There was a resilience in her that intrigued him. The next day, the sun had barely risen when Minji was already on her way to the Lee mansion. Her heart beat a little faster than usual. She didn't know what awaited her. Would she be fired? Would she be ignored? Or would he confront her again? But behind the apprehension, there was a flame of hope. She refused to believe that the girl's joy was a crime. As she entered the imposing gates, the mansion seemed even more silent and imposing than usual. The air was charged with an invisible tension. Minji picked up her apron and her supplies, her movements deliberate, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. She headed to the hall, expecting to find the girls in their chairs, motionless as always. But to her surprise, the hall was empty. The wheelchairs were there, but the girls were not. A shiver ran down her spine. Where were they? A sudden panic engulfed her. Had he taken them away, or was it a trap? Suddenly, a cold, calculating voice made her jump. "Miss Kim!" Lee Jae-hyun stood at the top of the staircase observing her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, though still distant, carried an intensity she hadn't seen before. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken questions and a tension that promised to change everything. The air in the Lee mansion seemed to freeze, denser and heavier than the icy wind outside. Minji felt a shiver run down her spine, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the weight of that gaze, the voice that cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Lee Jae-hyun, at the top of the staircase, looked like a marble statue, imposing and unattainable, a judge ready to deliver his sentence. She pressed her lips together, fear threatening to suffocate her breath, but a stubborn flame of defiance burned in her chest. She wouldn't bow, not after seeing the joy in the girl's eyes. He began to descend, each step echoing on the polished marble, a sound that seemed to amplify the frantic beating of Minji's heart. His eyes, once distant, now fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, as if he could read every thought, every emotion she desperately tried to hide. He stopped a few feet from her, his height and presence enveloping her like a shadow. "Miss Kim," he repeated, his voice low, but carrying an unquestionable authority. "It seems you have a rather liberal interpretation of your responsibilities." Minji lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze. "My responsibilities include ensuring a clean and safe environment for your daughters, sir, and if I may, an environment that also promotes their well-being." A muscle in Lee Jae-hyun's jaw twitched. He didn't expect such a direct, such bold answer. Most people would shrink under his scrutiny. But Minji didn't. There was a silent strength in her, a dignity he found irritating and at the same time strangely intriguing. "Well-being," he scoffed, the word laden with irony. "Do you believe that playing with dolls and making noise contributes to well-being in my house?" "I believe that joy, sir, is essential for the well-being of any child," Minji replied, her voice firm, despite her dry throat. "Yoonji and Yeji are children. They need light, laughter, moments of lightness. They deserve it." The silence that followed was deafening. Lee Jae-hyun studied her, his dark eyes trying to penetrate her calm facade. He expected to see fear, remorse, perhaps even anger, but all he found was unwavering determination. This woman was different. She wasn't like the other employees, who bowed to his will, or like the partners, who sought only their own interests. She seemed genuinely concerned about his daughters, and that disarmed him in a way he didn't know how to process. "Where are the girls, sir?" Minji asked, breaking the silence, genuine concern in her voice. "The hall is empty." Lee Jae-hyun hesitated for an almost imperceptible moment. Her question, so simple, yet laden with a concern he didn't feel in himself, struck him. He remembered the rag doll, Hyeji's sad gaze, Yoonji's laughter. He had spent the night awake, their image mixed with Minji's, haunting his thoughts. "They are in the winter garden," he finally said, his voice a little softer than he intended, "with Mrs. Park." Minji blinked, surprised. The winter garden was a place rarely used, a more open and bright space than the main hall. It was a small glimmer of hope. He hadn't punished them. He had moved them. I moved them there, he continued, as if explaining himself, an attitude completely atypical for him. I thought that maybe the fresh air would do them good. Minji felt a small knot in her throat loosen. It was a small victory, a sign that her words, her actions, had not been completely in vain. But the tension still hung in the air. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions, Miss Kim?" he asked, returning to his cold tone. "You overstepped the bounds of your role. You interfered with the dynamic of this house, with my daughter's routine." "I had no intention of interfering, sir," Minji replied, her eyes fixed on his. "My only intention was to bring them a moment of happiness. They were so quiet, so alone." The word alone echoed in the silence, hitting Lee Jae-hyun like a blow. He knew it was true. He had built such high walls to protect himself from pain that he had ended up imprisoning himself, and worse, his daughters, in unbearable loneliness. The guilt which he tried to suppress returned with full force. "I cannot allow this to happen again," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "This house has rules. My daughters have a routine, and you must respect them." Minji nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. I will respect the rules, but please don't extinguish their light. Don't extinguish their joy." Lee Jae-hyun watched her, an internal battle raging in his eyes. He wanted to fire her. He wanted to restore order, control, the silence he had built to protect himself. But the image of the rag doll, the echo of laughter, and the purity in Minji's voice prevented him. There was a crack in his armor, and Minji had been the hammer blow that caused it. "You may continue your work," he finally said, the words seeming to cost him immense effort. "But with one condition." Minji waited, her heart beating fast again. "From today on," he continued, his eyes fixed on hers, "your responsibility will not only be to clean. You will spend an hour a day with my daughters in the winter garden, and you will ensure they have moments of lightness." Minji's eyes widened, shocked. It was the opposite of what she expected. It was an order, yes, but an order that opened a door that allowed light to enter. I will do that, sir," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise." Lee Jae-hyun merely nodded, his expression still unreadable, but there was a subtle tension in his shoulders that seemed to have lessened a little. He turned and climbed the stairs again, disappearing down the corridor. Minji stood there alone in the hall, the echo of his words still resonating. An hour a day with the girls, not as a cleaner, but as someone who would bring them lightness. It was a test, she knew, a risky gamble he was taking against his own nature, but it was also a chance to bring a little color into the lives of those children, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little light into the darkness of that house. The silence of the Lee mansion was still heavy, but now Minji could swear there was a small crack, through which a ray of sunshine was beginning to sneak, and she was determined to open it. The air in the Lee mansion was still heavy, but now Minji could swear there was a small crack, through which a ray of sunshine was beginning to sneak, and she was determined to open it. Lee Jae-hyun's words echoed in her mind, a dissonant melody of authority and a strange concession. An hour a day, moments of lightness. It was an order, yes, but one that carried the weight of permission, of a hope she dared not dream. She took a deep breath, her heart still beating fast, but now with a new energy. The tension hadn't disappeared, but had transformed into cautious excitement. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission to bring light to two small souls trapped in darkness, and perhaps, just perhaps, to the hardened heart of the man who protected them so misguidedly. Minji headed to the winter garden, her steps lighter than usual. Mrs. Park awaited her at the door with an expression of surprise and a slight smile on her lips. It was clear that the news of Minji's new role had already spread. The winter garden was a refuge of glass and plants, flooded by the morning sunlight. The girls were there, sitting in their wheelchairs, their pale faces turned towards the green leaves and colorful flowers. Yunji, the elder, seemed to watch a sunbeam dance on a leaf, while Hyeji, with her rag doll in her lap, looked at the floor, lost in her own thoughts. "Good morning, girls," Minji said softly, approaching. She knelt to be at their height, a gesture Lee Jae-hyun would never make. "I'm Minji, and today I came to spend some time with you." Yunji looked up, a flicker of curiosity in her usually distant gaze. Hyeji clutched the doll, but also lifted her head, her large, dark eyes fixed on Minji. Mrs. Park discreetly withdrew, leaving the three alone. The hour had begun. Minji had no plan. There was no manual for moment of lightness. She just followed her instinct. She picked a small flower from a nearby pot, a pale pink camellia, and showed it to Hyeji. "Look, Hyeji, how beautiful. Smell it." Hyeji hesitated, then extended a trembling little hand and touched the petals. An almost inaudible sigh escaped her lips. Yunji, meanwhile, watched every movement, a subtle tension in her shoulders. Minji realized that their trust was something to be earned, not demanded. "Do you like stories?" Minji asked, sitting on the floor between their chairs. "I know a story about a little butterfly that wanted to fly to the moon." She began to tell it, her voice soft and melodious, weaving a simple narrative of adventure and courage. She used hand gestures, changed her tone of voice for each character, and gradually felt the atmosphere in the winter garden change. Yunji's eyes followed her movements, and Hyeji, who had been clutching the doll, now held it more loosely, absorbed in the story. Upstairs, in his office, Lee Jae-hyun tried to focus on financial reports, but his mind was a whirlwind. He had given an order that went against everything he believed was necessary to protect his daughters. Moments of lightness. The phrase seemed ridiculous, naive. But the image of Minji's eyes, her determination, wouldn't leave him alone. He found himself listening, though he wouldn't admit it. The sound of Minji's voice, muffled by the walls, reached him, a soft and unusual melody in the silent house. It was different from the chaotic noise from before. It was a sound that seemed peaceful. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the winter garden. The glass reflected the sunlight, preventing him from seeing clearly, but he could feel her presence down there with his daughters. A pang of something he couldn't identify, curiosity, fear, struck him. He had opened a door, and now he didn't know what he would find on the other side. In the winter garden, Minji finished the butterfly story. A cozy silence settled. Then Yunji, in an almost inaudible voice, asked, "The butterfly, did it reach the moon?" Minji smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Yes, Yunji, with much courage and a little imagination it did. And it discovered that the moon was made of cheese." Yeji let out a little giggle, a sound so rare and precious that it made Minji's heart ache. Yunji also smiled, a small, fleeting smile that transformed her face. It was a victory, a small but significant victory. The hour flew by. Minji not only told stories, she described the colors of the flowers, the smell of the damp earth, the sound of the wind in the leaves. She encouraged them to touch the plants, to feel the different textures. She treated them as children, not as patients. And they responded. not with grand gestures, but with small signs of life, of engagement, of joy. When Mrs. Park returned to announce the end of the hour, Min-ji felt a pang of sadness. She said goodbye to the girls, who now looked at her with a different sparkle in their eyes. "See you tomorrow, girls," she said. As she left the winter garden, Min-ji felt Lee Jae-hyun's gaze. She didn't see him, but she felt his presence, the intensity of his observation. It was as if he were a shadow, always present, always evaluating. She knew she was walking a fine line, but the joy in the girl's eyes was her compass. Lee Jae-hyun, from the top of the staircase, watched Min-ji leave the winter garden. He hadn't confronted her, hadn't come down. He just watched. Her face, once tense, now carried an expression of serene satisfaction. And, for a brief moment, he thought he heard a different sound coming from the winter garden as she left. A sound that was not the usual silence. A sound that seemed an echo of laughter. He frowned, the enigma of Min-ji and her effect on his daughters deepening. He had tried to control everything, but she, with her simplicity and courage, had introduced an unpredictable element into his carefully constructed life. The crack in his armor was widening, and he didn't know if he could contain it. The Lee mansion was still a place of silence, but now that silence seemed laden with a new melody, a melody of hope and uncertainty. And Lee Jae-hyun, the millionaire CEO, found himself, for the first time in a long time, without total control over the next chapter of his own story. The echo of laughter. Lee Jae-hyun clung to that fleeting memory, trying to decipher it. It wasn't a clear sound, but a resonance, a vibration that seemed to have filled the emptiness of the mansion for an instant. He had built walls of silence to protect his daughters, to protect himself from pain. And now a simple cleaner was tearing them down, brick by brick, with laughter and stories of butterflies. The armor he had forged over the years, made of control, routine, and calculated coldness, was rusting. Min-ji had found the crack, and with each passing day it seemed to widen. He felt like a general who had lost control of his own battlefield. Min-ji's unpredictability was a threat to his meticulous order, but at the same time, a strange attraction. The next morning, Lee Jae-hyun found himself again at his office window, his eyes fixed on the winter garden. He didn't want to admit it, but he was waiting for the soft sound of Min-ji's footsteps, for her muffled voice. He had ordered her to bring moments of lightness, but he hadn't foreseen the lightness it would bring to the very atmosphere of the house. Min-ji, oblivious to the CEO's silent observation, entered the winter garden with a small package in her hands. Today, she had brought a set of colored pencils and a pad of paper. The girls awaited her, and Min-ji noticed a subtle difference. Yoon-ji, the elder, seemed less withdrawn, her eyes following Min-ji with a more open curiosity. Hye-ji, with her rag doll, even managed a small smile when Min-ji knelt down. "Good morning, my little artists," Min-ji said, unfolding the paper on the floor between them. "Today we're going to draw. Have you ever drawn before?" Hye-ji shook her head negatively, but Yoon-ji pointed to the vibrant flowers around them. Min-ji understood. They observed, but did not participate. "So let's begin," she said, picking up a sky blue pencil. "I'll draw the sky, and you can help me choose the colors for the flowers, for the leaves, for everything we see here." She began to sketch, her hand firm and gentle. It wasn't a work of art, but an invitation. She described each color, each stroke, as if painting a new world for them. "This is the blue of the sky, so vast and free, and this is the green of the leaves dancing with the wind." Upstairs, Lee Jae-hyun watched. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Min-ji's gestures. The way she moved with natural grace, how she leaned towards the girls, as if sharing a precious secret. He saw Yoon-ji extend a trembling little hand and touch the paper, then a colored pencil. Hye-ji, meanwhile, watched with an intensity he rarely saw. A part of him wanted to go down, interrupt, restore order, But another part, a part he didn't recognize, was fascinated. What was Minji doing? She wasn't a therapist, she wasn't a teacher, she was just herself. And that seemed to be the key. When Minji offered the red pencil to Hyeji, the girl hesitated for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, she took the pencil. Her fingers were clumsy, but she made a small scribble on the paper. It wasn't a flower, it wasn't anything recognizable, but it was a mark. It was participation. Minji smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. "How beautiful, Hyeji. It's a very special flower. What's its name?" Hyeji didn't answer, but her eyes sparkled. Yunji, seeing her sister, also reached out and took a yellow pencil. She drew an imperfect circle. "Sun," she whispered, her voice still weak, but clearer than before. Minji felt her heart fill. Small miracles. That's what she was witnessing. She encouraged them, praised every scribble, every chosen color. The hour flew by again, filled with the soft sound of pencils on paper and Minji's melodious voice. Lee Jae-hyun, upstairs, felt a tightness in his chest. He had isolated himself so much, had believed that silence was the only form of peace. But what he was seeing now was something different. It wasn't chaotic noise, but a soft melody of life, of interaction. When Mrs. Park came to get the girls, Minji helped them put away their drawings. "See you tomorrow, my artists," she said, and this time Yunji nodded, and Hyeji clutched the drawing she had made. As she left the winter garden, Minji felt Lee Jae-hyun's gaze. She didn't see him, but she felt his presence, the intensity of his observation. It was as if he were a shadow, always present, always evaluating. She knew she was walking a fine line, but the joy in the girl's eyes was her compass. Lee Jae-hyun moved away from the window, his mind in turmoil. Minji's report hadn't given him the answers he sought. Instead, it had deepened the mystery. She wasn't a calculated threat, but a force of nature, a gentle breeze that was turning into a wind threatening to tear down his walls. He had tried to control her with information, but she was immune to his cold logic. He picked up the phone, dialed his assistant's number. "I want a full report on Minji, everything, from the day she was born." His voice was cold, but there was an underlying urgency. He needed to understand. He needed to categorize, analyze, control. But deep down, he knew the cleaner had already escaped any category he could create, and the Lee mansion, with its echoes of laughter and its scribbles on paper, was transforming, whether he wanted it or not. Lee Jae-hyun's order hung in the air like a sentence, cold and definitive. "I want a full report on Minji, everything, from the day she was born." He clung to logic, to the need for data, for concrete facts to demystify the inexplicable. Minji was an anomaly in his controlled universe, and he needed to categorize her, fit her into a box he could understand. But deep down, a voice whispered that she had already escaped all the boxes he knew. The armor of control he had forged was under attack, not by an external force, but by something far more insidious: simplicity. The report arrived 2 days later, a stack of papers that seemed too small to contain the essence of a person. Lee Jae-hyun leafed through it in his office, the morning light filtering through the blinds. Minji's life was an open book, but written in a language he barely understood. No wealth, no influence, no formal education beyond high school. A simple childhood, marked by the early loss of her parents, raised by a loving grandmother in a small coastal town. Humble jobs from an early age, always with an impeccable reputation for honesty and diligence. No scandals, no hidden debts, nothing that could be used against her, just an ordinary existence, woven with threads of resilience and kindness. It was her simplicity that disarmed him. He was used to dealing with complexities, with hidden agendas, with the game of power. Minji had none of that. She was just herself, And this authenticity, this lack of artifice, was the most potent weapon he had ever encountered. He expected to find a flaw, a hidden motive, something that would justify the disturbance she caused in his order, but there was nothing. Just the image of a woman who, despite adversity, maintained an inner light. He found himself looking at an old photo attached to the report. Min-ji, still a teenager, smiling beside her grandmother, her eyes shining with unpretentious joy. It was a smile he hadn't seen in years, perhaps never, in his own world. A pang of something he couldn't name, envy, melancholy, struck him. He had built an empire, but at what cost? The silence in which he had taken refuge now seemed emptier than ever. That same day, Min-ji entered the winter garden with a small recorder and some soft children's songs. The girls awaited her, and the change was palpable. Yoon-ji, who had barely moved before, now turned her head when Min-ji spoke. Hye-ji, with her doll, seemed less tense, her shoulders slightly relaxed. Expectation. Once a stranger in the garden, now seemed to have found a home there. "Good morning, my little listeners," Min-ji said, sitting on the floor between them. "Today, we're going to listen to the music of the wind and the flowers. Have you ever heard a melody that makes your heart smile?" She turned on the recorder, and a soft melody filled the air. It wasn't the vibrant, chaotic music he forbade, but a delicate symphony, almost a whisper. Min-ji began to hum, her voice sweet and off-key, but full of emotion. She gently took Yoon-ji's and Hye-ji's hands and swayed them to the rhythm of the music. It's as if the flowers are dancing and the wind is singing to them. Upstairs, Lee Jae-hyun was back in his observation post. He had tried to focus on his work, but the image of Min-ji, the simplicity of her report, and the soft melody that now echoed muffled from the winter garden pulled him like a magnet. He couldn't see the details, but he could feel the atmosphere. The mansion, which had once been a tomb of silence, now pulsed with a new life, a life he hadn't invited, but which was taking root. He saw Min-ji lean in, whispering something to the girls. And then something happened that made him hold his breath. Yoon-ji, her eyes fixed on Min-ji, moved her lips. There was no sound, but it was a movement, an effort, an attempt to imitate the words Min-ji sang. Hye-ji, meanwhile, squeezed Min-ji's hand, a gesture of connection that was as rare as it was precious, a bond that he, the father, had never managed to forge. Min-ji smiled, her eyes welling up. "Yes, Yoon-ji, it's the music of hope." She didn't force, didn't demand. She just offered, and the girls, in their own silent language, were beginning to accept, to open up to the world Min-ji painted for them. The hour passed, and when Mrs. Park came to get them, Min-ji said goodbye with a gentle hug. This time, Eun-ji didn't shrink away. And Hye-ji, for the first time, didn't immediately let go of Min-ji's hand, holding it for an extra second, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Lee Jae-hyun watched Min-ji leave the winter garden, the expression of serene satisfaction on her face. He felt a knot in his throat. He had built his life on the premise that love was a weakness, that emotion was a risk. But Min-ji, with her simplicity and courage, was dismantling that premise piece by piece. He moved away from the window, his mind in turmoil. Min-ji's report hadn't given him the answers he sought. Instead, it had deepened the mystery. She wasn't a calculated threat, but a force of nature, a gentle breeze that was turning into a wind, threatening to tear down his walls. He had tried to control her with information, but she was immune to his cold logic. The Lee mansion, with its echoes of soft melodies and its small gestures of connection, was becoming a battlefield for Lee Jae-hyun's heart. He, the millionaire CEO who controlled empires, was losing control over the most intimate of his domains, his own emotions. And what frightened him most was that somewhere deep down, he wasn't sure if he wanted to regain it. The silence he so cherished was being replaced by a melody, and he didn't know if he could, or if he wanted to, silence it again. He was on the verge of an emotional precipice, and Minji, the cleaner, was the only one who seemed to hold the key to the abyss or to salvation. The silence Lee Jae-hyun so cherished had become an empty echo. The gentle melody Minji had brought to the mansion was not just a sound. It was a vibration that resonated in its walls, in its corridors, and more disturbingly, within him. He felt like a ship adrift, its sails torn by a breeze he had underestimated. Logic, his usual compass, failed to map this new emotional territory. He had tried to categorize Minji, but she was an unsolved equation, a force that defied analysis. The next morning, the mansion seemed to breathe differently. Lee Jae-hyun tried to immerse himself in his work, but every line of code, every financial report seemed faded compared to the vivid image of Eun-ji moving her lips or Hye-ji holding Min-ji's hand. He went down to the dining room, but breakfast was a solitary, tasteless ritual. Mrs. Park, who had once moved like a shadow, now seemed lighter, a discreet smile on her lips when she spoke about the girls. Even she was being touched by Minji. He found himself once again at the upstairs window observing the winter garden. Minji was there, sitting on the floor with the girls. Today, she had brought a storybook with large, colorful illustrations. Her voice, which he now recognized as a balm, filled the space. She didn't just read, she interpreted, changing her tone for each character, making dramatic pauses. He could see Eun-ji's eyes following the images, and Hye-ji, with her doll firmly hugged, seemed more attentive than ever. Minji turned a page, and the story spoke of a little bird learning to fly. She made a soft sound, imitating the flapping of wings. And then it happened. Eun-ji, with a visible effort, raised her right hand, her fingers extending slowly in the air, as if wanting to touch the imaginary bird. It wasn't a complete movement, but it was deliberate, intentional. Lee Jae-hyun felt an electric shock run through his body. He had never seen Eun-ji make such a spontaneous, such a desire-filled gesture. Minji saw it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, a radiant smile. "Yes, Eun-ji," she whispered, taking the girl's hand and gently guiding it. "The bird is flying. It's free." She then looked at Hye-ji, who was observing her sister with unusual intensity. "You can fly too, Hye-ji, with your imagination." Hye-ji pressed the doll against her chest, but her eyes sparkled with a new light. Lee Jae-hyun moved away from the window, his heart beating wildly. The air in his lungs felt thin. He needed air. He needed to understand what was happening. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't an illusion. It was real. His daughters, whom he had accepted as prisoners of their bodies, were beginning to free themselves little by little, under the gentle touch of a woman he barely knew. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence he tried so hard to maintain. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet led him towards the winter garden. He stopped at the door, hidden by the frame, observing. Minji was now singing a soft lullaby, swaying the girl's hands. Eun-ji had her head slightly tilted, her eyes half closed in contentment. Hye-ji, for the first time, had let go of the doll and was holding Minji's hand with both of hers. The scene hit him with the force of a punch. He, the father, the man who should protect and love them, had isolated himself. He had convinced himself that love was pain, that hope was an illusion. And now a stranger was showing his daughters what love was, what hope was. A sharp pain, deeper than any business loss, pierced his chest. It was the pain of regret, of blindness. Minji finished the song, and the silence that followed was not the empty silence from before, but a filled silence, a silence of peace. She looked at the girls, her eyes full of a tenderness Lee Jae-hyun had never seen, not even in his late wife. He felt a pang of jealousy, a feeling he despised, but which now consumed him. He took a step forward, the shadow of his body falling over the winter garden floor. Minji looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, just a serene calm, an acceptance. For an instant, time stopped. Lee Jae-hyun's eyes, usually cold and calculating, were filled with a confusion and vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. Minji's eyes, in turn, were a mirror that reflected his soul, not with judgment, but with silent understanding. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What would he say? Thank you? Stop? Who are you? None seemed appropriate. He just stared at her, trying to decipher the mystery she represented. Minji, without breaking eye contact, gently released the girl's hands. It's lunchtime. My little ones, she said, her voice soft but firm. She stood up and Mrs. Park, who had arrived silently, came to get the girls. Yoonji nodded at Minji, and Hyeji, before being led away, looked at Lee Jae-hyun. There was no fear in her eyes, just a childish curiosity, a silent question. When Minji passed him, a few inches away, he could smell the faint aroma of soap and something else, something fresh and clean like rain. He didn't move. She stopped, turned slightly, and their eyes met again. Thank you for taking care of them, Mr. Lee, she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. They are very special. And with that, she was gone, leaving him alone in the winter garden, the echo of her voice and the fresh aroma lingering in the air. He looked at the floor where she had been sitting, at the open storybook, at the empty space. The emotional precipice he had felt before now seemed much more real, much closer. Minji was not just the key to the abyss or to salvation, she was the very embodiment of both. He had tried to control the world, but now the world was controlling him, and he didn't know how to fight such a gentle yet overwhelming force. The silence of the mansion had been broken, and in its place a new symphony began to be composed, note by note, in Lee Jae-hyun's heart. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't want the music to stop. He wanted to hear more. He wanted to understand. He wanted to feel. The gentle aroma of soap and rain, which Minji had left behind, lingered in the winter garden air. A simple fragrance that, for Lee Jae-hyun, was more complex than any expensive perfume he had ever smelled. He remained there, motionless, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had been sitting, as if her very essence could still be captured in that empty space. Her words, "They are very special," echoed in his mind, not as an affirmation, but as a silent accusation. He knew they were special, but he had treated them like fragile crystal vases to be observed from afar, never touched, never truly loved. The pain that had struck him before had not diminished. On the contrary, it had deepened, transforming into a constant pang of regret. He had built an empire, but had neglected his own home, his own heart. The silence he so cherished, which had once been a refuge, was now a deafening reminder of his own absence. Minji, with her discreet presence, had torn the veil of his illusion, revealing the loneliness he had cultivated. He moved away from the winter garden, his footsteps echoing heavily in the mansion's corridors. Every painting on the walls, every meticulously selected piece of art seemed to mock him, a testament to a life of external perfection and internal emptiness. He climbed the stairs, not to his office, but to his daughter's room. He stopped at the door, observing them from afar. Yoonji was in her bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, but there was a serenity on her face he hadn't seen in years. Hyeji, with her doll firmly hugged, was looking out the window, a small smile on her lips. They were different. Minji had planted a seed of hope in their little hearts, and he, the father, was only just beginning to see the sprouts. The image of Yoonji reaching out for the imaginary bird, The sparkle in Hyeji's eyes, the way both held Minji's hand. These scenes replayed in his mind. A looping film he couldn't and didn't want to stop. He had tried to control the world with logic and reason, but Minji operated on a different plane, a plane of empathy and intuition. She didn't seek solutions, she offered connection. And that connection was dismantling his defenses, one by one. That night, Lee Jae-hyun couldn't focus on his work. The financial reports lay untouched on his desk. Instead, he found himself reviewing the report on Min-ji, the information he had collected so meticulously. Every detail about her simple life, her difficulties, her past, seemed irrelevant now. What mattered was not who she was on paper, but who she was in his home with his daughters. She was not a threat to be neutralized, but a force to be understood, and what he feared most was that in understanding her, he would have to understand himself too. He stood up, walking to his office window, observing the darkness that enveloped the mansion. The silence of the night was different now. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a pause, of a melody about to resume. He felt like a man who, after years living in a desert, suddenly found an oasis. The water was inviting, but he was afraid to drink, afraid to break the spell of his own barrenness. The next morning, he went down for breakfast earlier than usual. Mrs. Park was in the kitchen, and he could hear her soft voice. She was talking to someone. He hesitated at the dining room door, listening. "Yes, she's a blessing. Miss Minji," Mrs. Park was saying, her tone warmer than he had ever heard her. "The girls have never been so alive." Minji replied something Lee Jae-hyun couldn't discern, her voice a gentle murmur. He felt a pang of something he recognized with a shiver. Jealousy. Jealousy of his own housekeeper, jealousy of a cleaner. It was an irrational but undeniable feeling. He entered the dining room, and Mrs. Park bowed hastily, her smile disappearing. Min-ji was cleaning the coffee table in the adjacent living room, her back turned to him. He said nothing, just sat down, the breakfast before him seeming even more tasteless than before. He could feel her presence, the energy she radiated even without seeing her. Later, he found himself again in the upstairs corridor, observing the winter garden. Min-ji was there sitting with the girls. This time, she was showing them how to make paper origami, small, colorful birds she folded with dexterity. Yoon-ji watched with intense concentration, and Hye-ji, with a noticeable effort, tried to imitate Min-ji's movements with her own fingers. It was slow, clumsy, but it was an effort. And Min-ji was there, patient, smiling, guiding their small hands. Lee Jae-hyun felt a tightness in his chest. He had convinced himself that his daughters were a burden, a responsibility he didn't know how to carry. But Min-ji was showing him that they were a garden, waiting to bloom, and he, the gardener, had refused to water them. He needed to talk to her, not about work, not about the report, but about everything, about what she was doing, about what she was changing. He descended the stairs, each step a beat of his heart. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he could no longer remain silent. He could no longer be a passive observer in his own life, in his daughters' lives. When he reached the winter garden door, Min-ji looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no surprise, just the same serene calm as before. The girls, noticing the change in atmosphere, also looked at him. Yoon-ji, for the first time, did not avert her gaze. Hye-ji clutched her small paper bird to her chest, but her eyes, once filled with fear, now showed a cautious curiosity. Lee Jae-hyun took a step forward, his voice caught in his throat. He had prepared speeches for board meetings, for multi-million-dollar negotiations, but no words seemed sufficient for this moment. He just stared at her, and she stared back, a mirror of his own soul. The precipice was there, and he was on the edge, feeling the wind on his face. But this time it was not the wind of fear, but the wind of a new possibility. He was on the verge of a choice, And Minji, the cleaner, was the lighthouse illuminating the path, both to the abyss and to salvation. He wanted to speak, but what would he say? That he was afraid, that he was changing, that he needed her. The air in the winter garden seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken words. With the gravity of a moment Lee Jae-hyun knew would change everything. He stood there, a giant in his own castle, but felt smaller than ever, disarmed before Minji's serene calm. His eyes, which once saw the world in terms of profit and loss, now saw only the unfathomable depth of hers, a mirror reflecting his own troubled soul. He wanted to speak, but his voice refused to come out. It was as if every syllable was trapped by years of silence, of control, of an impenetrable facade he had built around himself. That he was afraid? Yes, an overwhelming fear of feeling, of failing again, of breaking the fragile hope Minji had planted. That he was changing? Undeniably. Every fiber of his being was being rewritten by that simple woman, by her kindness, by her capacity to see beyond the surface. That he needed her, the truth was a punch to the gut, a humbling recognition for a man who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency. He needed her. Not as an employee, not as a nanny, but as the bridge to a world he had forgotten, a world of warmth, of connection, of love. Minji didn't break eye contact. There was no challenge in her gaze, no fear, just a silent, almost compassionate understanding. She waited, patient, as if she knew he needed time to find the words, or perhaps to accept the silence. The girls, Yoonji and Hyeji, felt the tension in the air, but didn't fear it as before. Yoonji, with a newfound courage, held the small paper bird Minji had folded and extended it slightly towards him, a silent invitation. Hyeji, still clutching her bird, looked at her father, and a small, hesitant smile played on her lips. It wasn't the forced smile from before, but a genuine smile, born of the joy Minji had brought. That gesture, so small, so innocent, was the catalyst. The ice that encased Lee Jae-hyun's heart began to crack. He took another step, then another, approaching the small table where they sat. The aroma of soap and rain again enveloped him, a vivid reminder of her presence, of her purity. "Minji-si," he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. The sound of her name, pronounced by him, seemed to carry a different weight, an unexpected intimacy. She tilted her head slightly, still not averting her gaze. "Yes, Mr. Lee?" He stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched at his sides, a defensive posture he barely noticed. What are you doing with them?" The question came out more as an accusation than as curiosity, but the tone was one of desperation, not anger. Minji looked at the girls, then back at him, a soft smile on her lips. "I'm just playing with them, Mr. Lee, teaching them to see the beauty in small things." She picked up one of the paper birds and placed it in Yoonji's palm. "Yoonji-si is very talented, and Hyeji-si has a wonderful imagination." Her words were simple, but they pierced Jae-hyun's defenses as no criticism or praise ever had. He had neglected the beauty in small things, had ignored the talent and imagination of his own daughters, seeing only their limitations. He began, and stopped again. It was so hard to admit his own failure, his own blindness. I don't see them that way." The confession was painful, but liberating. Minji nodded, as if expecting this admission. "They are children, Mr. Lee. They need affection, laughter, stories. They need someone to show them that the world is still a magical place, even if they see it from a different perspective. And I haven't been that someone," he completed, his voice almost inaudible. The pain was sharp, but he didn't want it to stop. He needed to feel, needed to purify himself. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. It wasn't an invasion, but a gesture of silent support. "You are their father, Mr. Lee. No one can replace that. But sometimes we need help to see what's right in front of us. He stared at her, the image of his deceased wife flashing in his mind. His wife would have known what to do. She would have filled the house with laughter and love. But she was gone, and he had closed himself off, turning the mansion into a mausoleum. I don't know what to do, he confessed. The most honest sentence he had uttered in years. It was a surrender, a plea for help he never thought he would make. Minji smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, conveying a peace he longed for. Start by listening, Mr. Lee. Start by seeing. They have much to say, much to show. She looked at Yunji and Yeji, who now observed the interaction with less cautious curiosity. They are a gift that is just waiting to be unwrapped. The precipice was there, and he had taken the step. It wasn't a fall, but a leap of faith in a woman he barely knew, but who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, something that was neither pain nor fear, but a strange and powerful emotion. Minji-shi, he said again, his voice firmer now, but still laden with emotion. I want you to continue. I want you to stay. Those last words, I want you to stay, echoed in the silence of the winter garden. It wasn't an order, but an appeal from the millionaire CEO, the widowed father, the man who was falling apart and rebuilding himself at the same time. Minji stared at him, and for the first time, there was a shadow of something more in her eyes, a subtle surprise, perhaps a deeper understanding of what he had just asked. The power dynamic had shifted, and the man who controlled empires now asked, not demanded. And the future of that mansion and of his heart lay in the hands of a cleaner. The silence that followed those words, I want you to stay, was denser than any noise. It was a silence laden with years of a man's loneliness, a woman's contained hope, and the innocent expectation of 2 children. Lee Jae-hyun, the CEO who dictated the destinies of corporations, now waited, his heart pounding, for a cleaner's answer. His eyes, once dominating, now pleaded. He had stripped himself bare, revealed a wound he thought was healed, but which Minji had reopened with the light of her kindness. Minji didn't answer immediately. Her eyes, which had previously conveyed an unwavering calm, now seemed to ponder a universe of possibilities and responsibilities. She looked at the girls, then at the origami bird in Yunji's hand, and finally back at Jae-hyun. There was no triumph in her gaze, no exaggerated surprise, but a seriousness that made him feel the weight of his own plea. "Mr. Lee," she began, her voice soft but firm. "What exactly does stay mean to you?" The question caught him off guard. He had uttered the words in the heat of the moment, driven by a visceral need. But what did they really mean? He wanted her to continue bringing light into his daughters' lives. Yes, but he also wanted her to continue bringing light into his life. He wanted the peace she radiated, the simplicity that disarmed his complexity. He wanted the chance to learn to be a father, a man, again. He hesitated, searching for the right words, the honest words. "I want you to continue to be who you are to them, to us. I don't know how to do this alone. I don't know how to be the father they deserve, the father my wife would have been. You are showing me a way." The confession was deeper than he imagined. It was an acknowledgement of his own failure, of his own inadequacy, and at the same time, it was a request for partnership, for guidance. Minji nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on his as if she were reading his soul. "Mr. Lee, I am a cleaner. My job is to clean the house, not to fill the voids of a family. I am not a therapist nor a nanny. I am just Minji." Those words, uttered without resentment, but with crystalline clarity, were a cold shower, and at the same time, a relief. She was setting boundaries, reminding him of reality, and he respected that. He needed to respect that. "I know," he said, his voice a little stronger, "and I'm not asking you to be anything other than Minji. But the Minji I saw with my daughters, the Minji who makes them smile, the Minji who teaches them to see beauty, that Minji is what this house, what we need." He took another step, further closing the distance between them. The girls watched, their small faces reflecting the silent tension. Yunji clutched the paper bird, and Hyeji, with a slow movement, extended her own bird towards Minji, a silent gesture of support. Minji noticed Hyeji's gesture, and a soft, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She knelt to be at the girl's height, gently taking Hyeji's bird. "They are precious, Mr. Lee, and they need you more than anyone else. I can show them how to fold paper, but you are the one who teaches them to fly." She stood up again, her eyes meeting Jae-hyun's. "If I stay, Mr. Lee, it won't be to replace anyone. It will be to help you find your own way back to them. It will be to create an environment where they can grow, laugh, and dream. But you will have to be present. You will have to get your hands dirty, fold paper, tell stories. You will have to be the father." Her condition was not a burden, but a challenge that he, the CEO, accustomed to delegating, knew he needed to accept. He had hidden behind his pain, his work, his fortune. Now, Minji was calling him to the front line of his own life. "I accept," he said, without hesitation. The decision was clear, the conviction unwavering. "I will do whatever it takes. I need your help to learn." Minji watched him for a long moment, and then a genuine smile that reached her eyes illuminated her face. It was a smile of understanding, of acceptance, and of a strange promise. "Then, I stay, Mr. Lee," she said, and the weight on his chest seemed to lessen, replaced by a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "But with one condition." He waited, his heart still racing, but now with new hope. "You have to call me Minji," she continued, her voice soft, but with a touch of humor. "And I'll call you Jae-hyun. After all, we're about to build something together, aren't we? And excessive formality can hinder the construction of paper birds." Her boldness, the breaking of protocol, was exactly what he needed. It was an invitation to a new kind of relationship, one where the barriers of status and wealth were less important than shared humanity. He felt a smile form on his own lips, a smile that was not forced, but born of unexpected joy. "Minji," he repeated, savoring the sound of her name, the intimacy it carried. "Yes, Minji, and you, Jae-hyun." The girls, as if sensing the change in atmosphere, let out small laughs. Yunji extended the paper bird to him, and Jae-hyun, for the first time in a long time, took it carefully, feeling the texture of the paper, the fragility of the creation. He looked at Minji, and in her eyes he saw not only the reflection of his own soul, but the promise of a future he had believed to be lost forever. The precipice had transformed into a new horizon, and he was ready to fly. The silence that followed that agreement was unlike anything Lee Jae-hyun had ever experienced. It wasn't the oppressive emptiness of his solitude, nor the respectful quiet of his subordinates. It was a filled silence, vibrant with the promise of a new beginning. Her name, Min-ji, sounded on his lips like a forgotten melody, and her response, Jae-hyun, was an echo that resonated in his chest, warming him in a way he hadn't felt since his wife had passed. The girls, Yunji and Hyeji, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Their small laughs, once contained, now floated freely through the winter garden, like the origami birds they held. Jae-hyun looked at the bird in his hand, the texture of the paper, the delicacy of the folds. It was a simple object, but it carried immense weight, the weight of a new responsibility, of a new hope. He didn't know how to fold a bird, but he knew Minji would teach him. And more importantly, he knew his daughters would teach him to see the world through their eyes. Minji stood up, her soft eyes meeting his. There was no longer the rigid formality, the distance imposed by status. There was only understanding and a quietness that calmed him. "So, Jae-hyun," she said, her voice a little more relaxed now, "where do we begin?" The question caught him off guard. He, the man who planned multi-million-dollar corporate strategies, had no idea how to begin rebuilding his own family. He looked at the girls, then at Minji. I don't know. I never did this before." The confession was embarrassing, but he felt no shame. Just a strange vulnerability that Minji seemed to accept without judgment. She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Don't worry, no one is born knowing, but the important thing is wanting to learn." She knelt again beside the girls. "Yoonji Hyeji, Daddy wants to learn how to make paper birds with you. Can you teach him?" The girls' eyes widened. The idea of teaching their father, the distant and always busy CEO, seemed like a fantasy. Yoonji, the more expressive one, let out a small cry of joy and extended her bird to Jae-hyun again, as if offering him the key to her world. Hyeji, with her usual quietness, just smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, conveying pure happiness. Jae-hyun knelt, awkwardly, beside his daughters. The cold floor of the winter garden contrasted with the warmth radiating from them. Minji, sitting opposite them, began to demonstrate the first steps to folding a new paper bird. "First, we take the paper like this," she instructed, her voice soft and patient. Jae-hyun tried to imitate her movements, his large fingers, accustomed to keyboards and luxury pens, now struggling with the delicacy of the paper. He crumpled the first sheet, then the second. A familiar frustration began to bubble up, but then he looked at Yoonji, who watched him with a mixture of curiosity and encouragement. She laughed, a clear, crystalline laugh, and pointed to her own bird, as if to say, "Don't worry, Daddy, you'll get it." Minji didn't intervene directly, but her words were a balm. "Don't rush, Jae-hyun, it's a process. The important thing is the intention, not perfection." She helped him unfold the crumpled paper, showing him the correct crease again. That afternoon, the winter garden, once a silent and untouched sanctuary, filled with laughter, murmurs of instruction, and the occasional frustration of a CEO learning to fold paper. Jae-hyun felt something unfold within himself too. Each fold of the paper was a small step towards unfolding the layers of pain and isolation that enveloped him. He was there, present, in a way he hadn't been for years. He felt the touch of his daughters, heard their voices, saw their smiles, and in each of these moments he felt Minji's silent and encouraging presence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Jae-hyun finally managed to fold a paper bird that, though imperfect, was recognizable. It was crooked, a little crumpled, but it was his. He held it with a pride that surpassed any closed deal or successful merger. Yoonji and Hyeji applauded, their small hands clapping, and Minji gave him a smile that was worth more than 1,000 words. "It's beautiful, Jae-hyun," she said, her voice soft. "It's the beginning." But the outside world didn't wait. The shrill ring of his cell phone broke the magic of the moment. It was his assistant, with an urgent report about a late-night meeting. He hesitated, looking at the paper bird in his hand, at his daughter's smiles, at Minji's understanding gaze. The old routine called him. The empire demanded his attention. He felt the weight of the choice. The life he had built, the life that had taken him away from his daughters, was there, knocking at the door. He knew he couldn't ignore it forever. But now he had a new priority, a new purpose. "I need to take this," he said, his voice tense, but his eyes still fixed on the girls. "But I'll be back, I promise." Minji nodded, her expression serious. "They need your presence, Jae-hyun, not just your promise." Those words hit him with the force of a punch. He knew she was right. The promise was easy, the presence, the challenge. As he walked away to answer the phone, the paper bird still in his hand, he felt the weight of that challenge. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long and full of obstacles. The biggest one, perhaps, was not the corporate world, but the battle against the man he had become. And he knew he would need all the help he could get to become the man his daughters deserved. The man Minji was helping him rediscover. The shrill ring of the cell phone tore through the quiet of the winter garden like lightning. It was a sound from the world Jae-hyun had tried, for a brief and precious moment, to forget. The world of numbers, deadlines, decisions that shaped empires, but which had emptied his own life. He stepped away, the crumpled paper bird still in his hand, a fragile reminder of the promise he had just made. "Yes, Assistant Kim." His voice sounded harsher than he intended, an echo of the persona he had worn for years. On the other end of the line, the urgency was palpable. A crisis in one of the most important projects, an unavoidable late-night meeting. Each word was a hammer, striking the wall he was trying to tear down. He looked back at the winter garden, where Minji sat with Yoonji and Hyeji, their silhouettes soft against the sunset. They laughed, a sound he now realized was the most important melody of his life. "I have to go," he told Minji, his voice laden with a newfound frustration. It wasn't frustration with work, but with the interruption, with the gravitational force pulling him back into the abyss of his old existence. "But I'll be back, I promise." And Minji's words echoed in his mind as he hurried to the car. "They need your presence, Jae-hyun, not just your promise." They were words that haunted him, a constant reminder that intention, however pure, was not enough. Presence was the true challenge. The meeting was a blur of charts, projections, and heated discussions. His executives spoke of profits, risks, aggressive strategies. He listened, responded, made decisions with the same precision as always, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw the crooked paper bird he had folded, Yoonji's smile, Hyeji's quietness, Minji's understanding gaze. Every time an executive spoke of priorities, he thought of his daughters. Every time they spoke of investment, he thought of the time he needed to invest in them. The old armor was cracking. He ended the meeting abruptly, to the shock of his subordinates. "We'll continue this tomorrow," he declared, his voice firm. "There's something more important I need to do now." The surprise on their faces was evident. CEO Lee Jae-hyun, the relentless workaholic, was leaving before midnight. The drive back home seemed longer than usual. The mansion was dark and silent when he arrived, a stark contrast to the vibrant scene he had left behind. The silence was oppressive, reminding him of all the years this house had been just a place to sleep, not a home. He climbed the stairs, his heart heavy. The girls would be asleep. He had broken his promise of presence. As he passed Yoonji and Hyeji's room, the door was ajar. A soft light escaped, and he heard a low murmur. He peeked in. Minji was sitting between the girls' beds, reading a story. Their voices were low and melodious, and the girls, and in their blankets, listened with half-closed eyes. The scene was so peaceful, so full of warmth, that a pang of envy struck him. She was there. She was the presence he had failed to be. Minji looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. A soft smile touched her lips, without censure, just understanding. She gestured to him, a silent invitation. He hesitated for a moment, feeling like an intruder, but then stepped forward, entering the room. He sat in an armchair in the corner, watching her finish the story. When she closed the book, the girls were already asleep, their faces serene. Minji stood up and approached him. "They missed you," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely broke the silence. "But I told them Daddy was working hard so they could have a happy life." He felt a knot in his throat. I wanted to come back sooner." She touched his arm, a light gesture but full of support. "You're here now. That's what matters. The journey is long, Jae-hyun. You don't have to be perfect all at once." She looked at the sleeping girls.